Hey campers, this is NPS Ranger News. Our program features the amazing work of National Park Service Rangers, protecting people and parks across the country through law enforcement, search and rescue, emergency medicine, firefighting, and other emergency services. I'm Greg Jackson, your host. NPS Ranger News updates news stories every day as they happen, both on Facebook and Twitter. On Facebook, find us at /NPS Ranger News. On Twitter, we're at NPS_Ranger. With me today is Paul Berkowitz. Paul Berkowitz is a special agent who's retired from the National Park Service. He served in parks as diverse as Lake Mead National Recreation Area, Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, Yosemite National Park, Whiskeytown National Recreation Area, served in Washington, D.C., also served at Grand Canyon National Park, and finally on the Navajo Indian Reservation in northeastern Arizona, focusing on Indian country crimes. He retired in 2007 and now spends much of his time writing and teaching about subjects related to law enforcement. Some of his books are The Case of the Indian Trader, Billy Malone and the National Park Service Investigation at Hubble Trading Post from 2011. His latest book was Legacy of the Yosemite Mafia, came out last year in 2018. And today we're going to talk about his first book. It came out in 2000, it was in the 1900s, 1995, was it, Paul?
Well, the last version published was in 1995, right?
1995, and it is called U.S. Rangers, Law of the Land. Did I get that right?
Yeah, U.S. Rangers, the Law of the Land, and then it was subtitled The History of Law Enforcement in the Federal Land Management Agencies. And
if you have a copy of that book, it is worth a fortune on the used book market. There's some out there. I've looked around for copies to give as gifts, and my goodness, there's little used book outlets for a couple $100 selling them. So hard to come by. But Paul is looking at updating the book. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how the book originally came to be, where it's going now. How did it originally? How did you get the idea to come up with the book, Paul?
Well, it kind of began just with my own personal experiences and observations when I was starting in the Park Service. So I started working seasonally for the Park Service in the early 1970s when I was going to college. And I know this kind of dates me, but back in those days, things were pretty loose, and when I was not even 21 years old, but I was a seasonal, I worked seasonally while I was going through college. I worked at the Grand Canyon every summer, every Christmas, every Easter vacation. I spent my time up there, and I had the opportunity then to ride around with what you might consider the real rangers at the time, and on their patrols at night and on my days off. And, roll into bar fights and traffic accidents and things like that was kind of my first exposure to what Rangers did, separate from the interpretive side that I was doing there then as just a volunteer. And simultaneously, I kept hearing from Park Service management that Rangers don't do law enforcement, that Rangers don't wear guns, all this kind of mythology that still exist about the Park Service, but it contradicted everything I was seeing firsthand. And I was kind of baffled by that, but I was also fascinated by that. And then when I turned 21, I was able, literally, I think probably on my birthday that I turned 21, I started working at Lake Mead National Recreation Area and got a pretty heavy dose of pretty serious law enforcement. And back in those days, again, I was doing like the 9 or 10 month seasons, so they're virtually year-round. And again, the work and the activity that I saw there totally contradicted all of the mythology and all of the stereotypes about Rangers. And I became fascinated about why that mythology existed, why there was such conflict and contradiction in terms of the image of the Ranger. And I simultaneously started to wonder, well, how much real activity, how much law enforcement background has really been buried about the Park Service? If I'm seeing these contradictions, how much of this actually has gone on in the past that hasn't been documented, that hasn't been acknowledged? And bit by bit, just over the course of my career, I started taking notes about things that I heard from quote-unquote old-timers. Moving on in my career became permanent. My first permanent assignment was at Indiana Dunes as a criminal investigator there. And then I transferred to Yosemite. And in Yosemite, I had the opportunity to really delve in on a research level into the topic. And they had a great research library there, all kinds of archival photographs. And just on my own time, I started leafing through these photographs and seeing pictures of Rangers from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, armed, wearing firearms, wearing defensive equipment, and engaged in law enforcement activity. And so from that, I actually started to try to dig into some of the newspaper accounts and old reports, and actually found documentation on legitimate, serious law enforcement issues that plagued the Park Service and that the Rangers dealt with all the way back to the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. I started compiling that material and reaching out actually to some of the old-timers that were still alive back in those days for their recollections. And interestingly enough, a lot of the old-timers that I reached out to still had copies of their police reports, photographs, all these kind of newspaper accounts that had never been cataloged by the Park Service. And that was the beginning of actually kind of formalizing the research.
Paul, you mentioned that you had contacted some of the people involved in some of these incidents. What was their reaction in being contacted, and what did they have to say?
Well, the most compelling story was there was a guy named Elton Davis, who was involved in a shootout at Grand Teton National Park in 1953, and he was shot and in the hospital for over a month. And I had heard about him just through word of mouth and tracked him down. Probably it was in the 80s that I was able to track him down. He was still alive then. And got a hold of him on the phone. And he was absolutely stunned that for the first time since his shooting, all the way back in 1953, that anybody gave a damn. Because nobody in that interim period had contacted him, nobody had ever interviewed him, nobody had ever expressed any interest in what he had been through. And it was pretty remarkable. I mean, it was a very emotional first contact. And then subsequently, he still had all of the newspaper clippings, he still had all of the reports documenting the shootout, and in fact, he still had the bullet that they took out of him, that he had turned into a tie clip. So, I mean, this was a very significant, traumatic episode in his life that had never been acknowledged officially by the Park Service. He subsequently sent me all of his files, all the newspaper clippings, all of the reports. I have them in my files now, but it speaks to the fact that a lot of our predecessors really went through some, pretty tough, very violent incidents that were not acknowledged, and that these guys, largely, guys back then, were not acknowledged for what they had done, how they had sacrificed for the Park Service, for the public. And that's just a major gap in the history. Same thing goes with people before him and people after him who got involved because of their official duties as Rangers in serious law enforcement incidents, and their contributions simply haven't been properly acknowledged. And I think that is something also, that's another motivation for getting this book out again, is to remind people of those sacrifices that our predecessors made and to learn from their experiences. Because a lot of times these people will tell you when you interview them, like Elt did and others, here's what I would have done differently. One incident that we talk about in the book was a guy named Joe Himes, who was involved. He tracked down a poacher in the backcountry of Glacier, hiked him out over the course of 3 days, and part of the struggle that he had was that they didn't issue handcuffs back in those days. He had his own gun that he carried, he had his own rifle that he carried, but he didn't have any handcuffs, and that led to a knockdown, drag out to the death, or kind of fight with the suspect that he had to march out of the backcountry for 3 days. And that's one that you may recall was chronicled recently in a newspaper article, totally misrepresented what happened, and basically the spin that the newspaper article put on it was that the Rangers weren't always your friend. They weren't always nice guys. Well, that's BS. This guy was not a nice guy, the suspect. And Joe Himes was compelled basically to take these measures. He basically knocked the guy out, slamming his head against a tree because he didn't have adequate defensive equipment. Well, there's a key learning point for us. And the same thing with the incident with Elt Davis back at Grand Teton. All these circumstances that influence the outcome are worth studying. And by not having that history in front of us, by not scrutinizing these things, by not interviewing people who were involved in these incidents, we lose a great opportunity to correct mistakes that were made in the past. And you know, that contributes also to, you know, mistakes that we make today. We should be learning from our history, and that's one of the real reasons I'm interested in this history. I remember the first document that I produced was about 27 pages, and it simply chronologically listed every officer-involved shooting or every shooting of a ranger or serious assault of a ranger that I had found. And I started presenting those in lectures to select groups, and I think it was in 1989. The U.S. Forest Service asked me to attend one of their in-service sessions in Atlanta. There were probably 300 or 400 of their law enforcement personnel there. And of course the research, because of the overlapping history between the forest preserves and the national parks, there was a lot of overlap in these characters and in this history. And by presenting that lecture series there with a lot of the photographs projected on screen of the stuff that I had found, I started getting flooding with material from other people about incidents that they had heard about. And that just made the research project all that much easier. So instead of my having to reach out to people, people started reaching out to me with incidents that they had had or accounts that they had heard about. And that made follow-up really a pretty easy task. So I started getting leads about all this previously undocumented history of law enforcement and federal land management. And that just kind of grew and grew. And at some point there was enough material there, I thought, to put into a book. And I think the first book that I actually published was probably in 1990 or 91. And then every year I was getting so much more information and so much more documentation that every year I would re-release the book, U.S. Rangers, The Law of the Land, with a new version. And the last version of that I actually published was in 1995. And by that time it was about a 500-page document with literally hundreds of documented incidents. So that was the beginning of the publication. And by 1995, my hope was that, okay, we've rebutted the mythology, we've corrected the record to a great extent, showing this genuine history of serious law enforcement performed by rangers and crime that actually does occur in parks, going back all the way to the late 1800s, all the way up through 1995, with the hope that, okay, we've set the record straight. Now, hopefully, the agencies will start to document their own and chronicle the material from here on. So there's really not a pressing need for it. And as you may recall, just last year, there were a couple of alarming statements made by the National Park Service, as well as by some of the authors chronicling this stuff, that basically ignored all that history. Once again, they claimed that rangers didn't carry guns until the 1970s, that there was never crime in the parks till the 1970s, and it was like, well, I guess we need to revisit this issue, and so that's kind of the impetus for going back through, updating the material, maybe making it a bit more sophisticated publication.
Yes, and it's back to the to the Ken Patrick incident, where Ken Patrick was murdered at Point Reyes National Seashore, and
right in 1973.
1973, and even in this book that came out, it was sanctioned by the Park Service. I can't remember the name of it, but I think you have it on the website. In that book, sanctioned by the Park Service, with a foreword by the then director of the National Park Service, maintaining that Ken Patrick was the first ranger murdered in the National Park Service, which of course is not true. He was the third. So somehow or other, all this history
forgotten, ignored, whatever the cause is. Kind of alarming, and again, maintaining that there was no serious crime in parks until the 70s and 80s, which is a total myth. So that really is the motivation to update the book, get it out there, provide a resource to public relations people in the agency to at least be able to look into a document to hopefully give better and more accurate information to the media, and just stop this mythology and stop the bad information getting about rangers and national parks.
Well, it's got to be horribly frustrating in that in the 1970s, when Ken Patrick was murdered, the Park Service said that was the first time a ranger was murdered in the line of duty. And after all of your efforts, plus after the murders of several other rangers, to have a book published and reviewed by the Park Service for the centennial of the Park Service, to basically just go turn the clock back to the 70s. How did that sit with you?
Well, you're right. It was frustrating, and damaging, because one of the real handicaps that the Park Service rangers have had over the years is this image that rangers don't do law enforcement, that there's no need for law enforcement in parks, which overall creates a more dangerous situation for rangers who are doing law enforcement. More dangerous in that they get challenged about their authority, get challenged about the need for them to even be there, get challenged when it comes to funding and staffing levels of law enforcement that's needed in the park. So there's a whole host of reasons why the ranger image has a negative impact on parks and on rangers. There are positive aspects to rangers, i.e. that they're friendly, that they're approachable and all that, but the part of the image that dismisses the serious law enforcement component has a real downside. And I think accounts in some respects for why rangers are among the most frequently assaulted of federal law enforcement officers, and on top of all the other challenges that they face because of the remoteness, the lack of backup, lack of communications and dispatch capabilities and all those other things that make the job one of the most challenging in law enforcement.
So you're familiar with the study from the FBI that profiles victim officers that have been killed in the line of duty. I think the study is called In the Line of Duty, either that or In the Line of Fire. I think it's In the Line of Duty. It profiles victim officers, as you were saying, of, those that are more public relations oriented than not. Those that are more likely to use force, or actually they're least likely to use force than their fellow officers. How does that match up, or does it match up, or have you looked at it with the profile of the rangers that have lost their lives or been assaulted while on duty?
Well, it's interesting going back to the original research that I began in the 80s, and interviewing a lot of these people who were still around, recalling even shootings as far back as the 40s and 50s. Back in those days, people were very much aware of the hazards that existed, the individual rangers and individual parks. But over the years, because of this, again, the mythology, I don't want to overuse the word, but the bad information, the lack of accurate records and documentation about the actual history, a lot of employees themselves, a lot of rangers, were trained or taught or somehow educated to believe that it wouldn't happen to them. And it translates into a lack of mental preparation, a lack of proper tactics in their law enforcement activities, because they as employees had not heard about how frequently this occurs in parks, and how frequently rangers are assaulted, and the fact that rangers have been murdered, and the fact that rangers have been engaged in gun battles. And if you think it's never happened in the past, then there's a tendency to think, well, it's not going to happen to you. And so that's one of the real hazards associated with this line of work. And by the failure to educate our rangers about the reality of the job, the fact that law enforcement in the Park Service is law enforcement, and that they need to be as prepared as any other law enforcement officer out there. So that lack of mental preparation, the belief that it won't happen to them, contributes to that mindset and their approach to the clientele that they deal with. Another thing, of course, is that the agency historically has not been tremendously supportive of law enforcement. So another factor that I found through these interviews largely was that there was a great apprehension on the part of rangers to use proper force or to use proper tactics, defensive tactics, in their interactions with criminals or even just with the public, kind of letting their guard down, not taking proper precautions just in their everyday interactions. That definitely has contributed to it. And then when you would talk to people who skirted a deadly situation, maybe they were shot at, they didn't get hit, or they just by the skin of their teeth made it out of a very violent encounter, they would speak to their reluctance to use proper force because, number one, they weren't prepared mentally, and number two, because they were concerned about how the administration, how their supervisors would react and the administrative repercussions had they taken proper precautions. So all of those things kind of factor into it.
Okay.
Accounting for why they are among the most assaulted.
Looking at the history as documented in the book and in some later documents, the Park Service maintains a list, and there's the Officer Down Memorial page that is sorted by agency, and one can look up the National Park Service officers that have died in the line of duty and those of other agencies. In the National Park Service, a large portion of the field law enforcement staff are seasonal park rangers, yet there are not a lot of seasonal park rangers that have lost their lives in the line of duty. Very few. I'm trying to think of, there was Michael Ballou at Bryce Canyon that died, and that was driving to a fire. It wasn't an assault on the officer. It was a driving incident on a fire response. Do you have any explanation on why seasonals seem to have an outstanding safety record in this capacity, or is it a safety record?
Well, it's limited because of the database, but interviewing or listening to boards of review, recordings where seasonals have been maybe on the periphery of these kind of violent incidents, part of what you hear is a reluctance to engage. For example, there was a officer-involved fatal shooting at Lake Mead in 1989, and actually the first ranger on scene, there was an armed gunman standing in the middle of a heavily trafficked intersection. The first ranger on scene was a seasonal, and in the board of review, he was remarkably candid, and frankly, showed a lot of courage by being candid about his mental state when he got there. And he acknowledged he was not prepared for that type of an incident, and he didn't take probably proper actions at the time because he lacked the confidence, he lacked the determination to do his job. And he even said in the board of review, he was waiting for somebody to tell him what to do. And I think that may be a part of why we see seasonals not really involved in some of these incidents, kind of holding back, waiting for the permanent to get there to give them instructions. Is it okay if I do this? Is it okay if I shoot, even though their training has taught them that this is a shoot situation? So there are a few incidents that you can document that mental preparation or the lack of mental preparation as causative to the outcome. But at the same time, I think there's a couple of incidents where there were seasonals involved in shootings and not necessarily good shootings. For example, back in I think In 1970, there was a seasonal ranger that shot and killed a teenager at Lake Mead, and a bad shooting. And in his testimony, he was actually tried for murder and acquitted. In the testimony, he basically, he was freaked out during the incident. He drew his gun, didn't know what to do, and maintained that the gun went off accidentally. So once again, just a lack of training, a lack of mental preparation, that all contributes to this. But among the most prevalent, I think, is waiting for somebody else to tell them what to do, not taking the initiative to maybe make a proper response, a use of force response that, in reality is called for given the circumstances.
As you're preparing to write or to update the book, are you finding your work to be easier this go around? I remember during the 90s and subsequently, when there was a significant use of force incident in the National Park Service, the movie came out almost. There were videos documenting the shooting. I know the Forest Service has done some of those as well, and then that kind of went away, at least for some of the agencies. How is collecting information going in these days?
Well, I try to keep tabs on things through the internet, which is a great resource. A lot of that stuff does come out online, at least preliminarily. It's probably a little bit more difficult these days to get the actual report, the investigative report, the board review, because everything now is strictly by FOIA. And back up until probably through the 90s, short of 2000, I would get a lot of this material firsthand from the officers that were involved. In fact, I would frequently just get calls from, hey, I was involved in a shooting, what do I do? So that I had that firsthand connection. Frankly, since then, and of course since I've been retired now almost 12 years, I probably don't have that connection. But one of the things that I think I probably will do, maybe through this broadcast that we're doing now and here in the near future, is put out a call saying, look, I'm trying to update the book. Anybody who has incidents that they want included in this, that they can share, any records they may have, any reports, I would love to have those so that they can be included in the book when it's updated. But again, it's kind of a mix, because you can get a lot of preliminary information just by scanning the internet, and of course you're maintaining the Twitter page that chronicles a lot of this stuff. So it's a mixed bag, but having that firsthand material is great. And of course that's a lot of what I want to include in the book, is literally excerpts from the police report, so that it's not me editorializing, it's simply here's the official account of what happened.
Do you have a guesstimated timeline and when you think this
No,
effort may be complete?
I really don't. Part of what I've got to do is organize my files. I've had at least a couple of moves since the last time I really buried myself in this. Need to sort through the files. One thing I will do is include a lot of the images, the pictures, the photographs, the crime scene sketches and things that I've had in files but didn't have technically the ability to put into that 1995 book. So it'll be heavily illustrated, so that it has much more popular appeal. But also, literally crime scene photographs. I have the crime scene photographs from the Ken Patrick murder, literally, and the autopsy reports, all those sort of things. So that's part of what I want to include to expand the utility of the publication, and also again just to kind of maybe in a more graphic way to make the point that this stuff's been going on for a very, very long time, and the public needs to know about it. The rangers need to know about it so that they're acutely aware of the risk that they face on the job, and Congress needs to know about it too, so that we can withstand the budget cuts and some of the noise that you hear about. Well, why is the Park Service doing law enforcement? Well, we've always done law enforcement, and we need to educate the legislators so that we have, I guess, more support, and that we can kind of withstand some of these challenges that come up periodically from anti-law enforcement managers and anti-federal politicians and communities.
Your work came out in the early to mid '90s, and following that into the early 2000s or 2005-ish, there were a number of reports on law enforcement and rangers being assaulted in the line of duty, coming up from the National Park Service and some of the other land management agencies. Have you seen anything recently showing any type of study into current trends on that from any of the land management agencies?
I have not, and it's pretty difficult to get a lot of the information. One of the problems historically, and I think it's still in play, is the Park Service is such a decentralized organization. Yeah, I mean, we've got WASO, you got regions, and supposedly have this structure, but there is still not a central repository for data. And while I guess IMARS and some of these reporting systems that are now in place purport to capture a lot of that material, I don't know, number one, that it's really doing that. The other thing is the incidents that get reported by individual parks, the types of cases it varies widely from park to park based upon management. For example, when I was working on the Navajo Reservation, there was a murder that occurred at Canyon de Chelly, inside the boundaries in a hotel there. And management, the superintendent there at the time, didn't want that reported. So it did not appear in any official Park Service records because that superintendent didn't want to document a murder that occurred in the park. So, and that's, probably just 11, 12 years ago. So there's really wide variances in the manner in which things are reported in parks, the accuracy with which they're reported. That's still a huge problem. And then you go back in time further, when there was not even an IMARS, there was absolutely no centralized repository for this type of information. And that accounts in part for why it's so difficult to chronicle and to document historic events, because everybody did their own thing. And once again, some parks, there was a shooting incident, I think at Buffalo River, where ranger shot a bad guy in a parking lot during a struggle. And that superintendent jumped all over the ranger for basically having an incident that he didn't want the park to have a reputation for. So they actively suppressed a lot of this information. And I think to some extent that occurs in a lot of parks around the country still, depending on the posture that management has and the support or the lack of support that may exist for law enforcement and law enforcement activity. It's a big challenge. And that's part of this image thing, this image hang-up that we have in the national parks.
And I'd suggest, too, that just because of staffing levels and budgets, that there are not a lot of people sitting in offices in Washington or in regions looking for projects to undertake that let's go find some data to analyze and take a look at that. There's just not the people and the staffing and the money to do that. You combine that with a lack of, tell me if I'm wrong, with a lack of interest in doing that or a lack of impetus to do that. You're not going to get the same reports that were created 15 years ago.
Right, but and again, I'm not intimately familiar with their database now that they have, and what information could be extracted. But the information that's put in, right, it's this garbage in, garbage out concept. That if there is not consistency in the types of things that are being reported in the field and the way in which they're being reported, it has a tremendous influence on even under best of circumstances what kind of product you might get.
Sure.
So, yeah. I mean, I've worked at parks where, for example, at Whiskey Town, when I was there, which was in the early '90s or mid '90s, we developed a really pretty advanced record keeping system there, so that every incident got chronicled, every assault got documented, and the rate of incidents that appeared in our database went up probably 400 or 500% compared to what it had been before, just because incidents weren't being documented previously. And then from what I understand, subsequently, because of new management, new superintendent, and posture that he wanted reflected, numbers went down. The actual activity didn't change, but the recording of the activity changed. And I still think that's a huge problem in the National Park Service.
Well, I'm sure that when word gets out that you are looking at documenting and collecting data, that you will begin receiving enough information to fill a book. Paul, with all this interest, I think, that people will have in supplying information, is there an address or an email address that people can use to contact you and supply you with information?
Yeah, the best way to get a hold of me right now would be through a mailbox that I maintain. So Paul Berkowitz, 10 Town Plaza, so that's 10, Town Plaza, number 330, Durango, Colorado, 81301. And that'd be a great first step, and then perhaps we can come up with an email and a phone contact that we can post on the website that you maintain, and really get the word out that we're looking to update these records and get information about incidents that need to be documented and included in the next book that I put out.
That's great. Yeah, put together an email address, and I will link it on NPS Ranger News and on our Twitter feed, and we'll be all set. Paul, thanks so much for your time, and good luck with the book.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for supporting what the Rangers do.
Well, campers, that's all for now. Check back for new shows every few days. Breaking news comes out when it happens on Twitter and Facebook. Thanks for listening. And in case you haven't figured it out, NPS Ranger News isn't affiliated with the government. I'm Greg Jackson for NPS Ranger News. See you on the trail.